Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Franklin.
My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning at Senate estimates, Liberal Senator Amanda Stoker repeatedly shut down questions about more than 680 COVID deaths in aged care. Senator Stoker made time for more questions about tweets, but said that aged care deaths weren't relevant. How on earth can the government claim that 680 deaths in aged care are not relevant, but Twitter is?
The member for Sydney already. It's only 2:01. The Prime Minister's the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every single death as a result of COVID-19 is a tragedy for every family and every community that has suffered from that death. And as we know, the majority of those deaths have occurred to those who have been most vulnerable. And those most vulnerable do live in our residential aged care facilities. And appropriately, the Royal Commission on Aged Care was tasked also with dealing directly with the issues that related to COVID-19 and the management of those matters in our aged care facilities. The government takes that extraordinarily seriously, and that's why we asked the Aged Care Commission to do that. The member makes reference to matters that were raised in Senate estimates today regarding the conduct of officers that are employed at the Royal Commission. It is very important that the Royal Commission engage in its work in a way that is completely non-partisan, that is completely independent, and I see it as the job of Senate estimates to probe into matters regarding integrity. I do, and that's its role. And it's the role of this parliament, Mr. Speaker, and questions are raised in this chamber, as indeed they are in estimates. That is the responsibility of members of parliament, and that's what senators are doing, whether it's in their capacity in estimates or other places, and that's what members do here.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's economic recovery plan is empowering Australians, such as the community of Chisholm, with the support they need to create and get more jobs so we can emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic with renewed strength and prosperity?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the member for Chisholm for her leadership in her community over what has been a very difficult year for all communities represented here in this place. But as I've remarked on many occasions, back at the start of this year, when the virus was first emerging out of China, Mr. Speaker, and it was many returning Australians from China to Australia that, through their actions in isolating, after we moved quickly to shut the borders and only allow residents returning to Australia, her community did so much to protect Australia from that first wave of COVID-19 here in Australia that we owe them a great debt. And to the member for Chisholm, I thank her for her strong leadership, working with her community to ensure that they are encouraged and supported during that time, and that continues to this day, because our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Speaker, and the COVID-19 recession that has followed is to ensure that Australians have been getting the right support when it comes to their health needs. Definitely, Mr. Speaker. Unprecedented investment to support the health response to COVID-19, but the response to support Australians, both to cushion the blow of the COVID-19 recession, but then through this budget and measures that were introduced before this budget to ensure that we had a strong plan for recovery out of the COVID-19 recession and to build for the future, is seeing Australians get back into work. It's seeing businesses reopen again. It's seeing Australians find that hope that they've been searching for, Mr. Speaker, that is so critical at times like this. And the response to the budget has given Australians hope. We've seen a confidence rebound, Mr. Speaker, but there is still much further to go. Again, National Cabinet will meet tomorrow. It will be our 30th meeting this year, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the Premiers and Chief Ministers for the way they have worked together with the Commonwealth over these many months. There have been disagreements from time to time, Mr. Speaker, but the work has continued, and there is so much more to do as we continue to ensure that Australia moves forward. We can't stay still when it comes to our response to COVID-19. We must continue to move forward, whether it's on the health front or the economic front on the support that is provided to help Australians too, particularly Victorians who have gone through the hardest of it over these many months. The hardest of it, Mr Speaker, and we need to move forward and we need to safely reopen Australia. Some months ago we talked about the need to get Australia open again by Christmas, and we remain committed to that goal. And I thank the other premiers and chief ministers who are sharing that commitment to ensure that Australians can go into 2021 with great confidence, with a strong working partnership at all levels of government in this country, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why has a government senator claimed that 680 aged care deaths are not relevant on the very same day that the Aged Care Royal Commission heard that 1 in 5 Australians in residential aged care have received substandard care and levels of abuse are, quote, a national shame? Why has the Prime Minister racked up $1 trillion of Liberal debt, $100 billion of new spending in the budget, but not fixed his broken aged care system, which is characterised by, according to the Royal Commission, neglect?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. It was a wide-ranging question, and I refer the member to my previous answer regarding the matters raised in the Senate. And, Mr Speaker, that is why the government invested more than $1.5 billion in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in the area of aged care. Mr Speaker, the shocking news that we knew would come forward out of a Royal Commission into aged care, when I initiated that Royal Commission, I said Australians need to prepare themselves. I said that we would need to prepare ourselves for some difficult and horrifying news, Mr Speaker, of the practices that have gone on in aged care, Mr Speaker, over a generation, over decades, and that matter was referred to by the Royal Commissioner himself in outlining what we would expect to see come forward and the areas that would be investigated over these many years. Now, Mr Speaker, every year our government has continued to increase our investment in aged care by $1 billion every single year and more. And in this most recent budget, the single largest increase in in-home aged care places, the single largest, to ensure that we have more than tripled the number of in-home aged care places since we came to government. And in-home aged care places was one of the key recommendations made in the interim report of the Royal Commission that we responded to both last year, and we said we would respond again in this year's budget, and we have, and we will keep responding again in the mid-year statement and again in next year's budget with a comprehensive response to the Royal Commission recommendations when they are handed down next year. And I thank the Royal Commission for the work they're doing. I thank all of those Australians who are coming to that Royal Commission. Mr Speaker, earlier today, the Leader of the Opposition and I joined together to speak of the work that has been done since the very important Royal Commission into institutional child sexual abuse and what has flowed from that. And I believe the same thing will flow from the Royal Commission into aged care, which is why I initiated it, because this is a matter that we have to deal with as a parliament and as a government. We are dealing with it as a government, but there is more to do, and the Royal Commission, I think, will greatly aid us in that quest to join us together to focus on the matters that need to be addressed in aged care. That's why I called it. That's why I'm looking forward to its recommendations. The news that comes from it is difficult for all of us, because so many of us in this place have sat around cabinet tables on either side of politics and dealt with the issues of aged care. And all of us, Mr Speaker, know there is more to be done. Thank you.
Just before I call the member for Lyne, I obviously allowed that last question and the one before, but just in terms of the scope for questions, the reason I allowed it was it had a number of elements to it, but the practice does make clear that ministers and the Prime Minister can't be asked about the statements of members, that is, non-ministers. And so whilst there's a way those statements can be referred to in a question, it does offend the standing orders to ask why a private member said a certain thing, because they're not part of the executive. So I'm just pointing that out to try and be helpful. I call the member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's budget is supporting regional Australia, particularly through the provision of additional investment in road safety?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question, Mr Speaker. The matter of road safety, I know, is an important one to the member and to each and every member in this place. In his inaugural speech, the member for Lyne emphasised the importance of infrastructure investment in improving road safety. I also acknowledge the work of the member for Cowper as the chair of the Joint Select Committee on Road Safety. I acknowledge Senator Alex Gallacher in the other place for his investment in what he has always said about road safety. The member for Wide Bay for his work as the inaugural chair of that body I mentioned, and the Assistant Minister, the member for Wright, for their important work in this, what is a bipartisan area. Road safety is paramount to each and every Australian, regardless of where you live. Our upgrades to the Pacific Highway in the member for Lyne's electorate have reduced fatalities by more than half. This is a significant and positive outcome for those communities and industries who rely on the Pacific Highway for essential travel. One life lost on the roads is one too many. One injury is one too many. I hear from the Leader of the Opposition. I know how invested he is in road safety measures too, and I know we've been as one on Princess Highway and other important work that we are doing. Too many families have been touched by loss, losing a family member, a loved one, a colleague, a friend. In this year's budget, I know the government was very, very pleased to announce $2 billion in road safety upgrades, $2,000 million that's going to go to important work in improving road safety measures for regional areas. This will include works such as shoulder sealing, rumble strips, physical barriers which could prevent vehicles from detouring off and head-on collisions and the like. In urban areas, works will focus on separating vulnerable road users such as cyclists and pedestrians from vehicular traffic. President of the Australian Local Government Association, David O'Loughlin, said, "We congratulate the federal government on having a clear focus on road safety, especially for our extensive local and regional road network, which will make a real difference in so many ways. The additional funding builds upon our $500 million targeted road safety program, which is rolling out now. Our $2 billion, split over 3 tranches, is making sure that the money is going to be spent as a use-it-or-lose-it system. We want the states and territories to get on with shovel-ready projects that are going to improve road safety outcomes for all Australians, be they live in regional areas or indeed metropolitan cities. We will continue to invest in road safety to align with and to support states and territories in working towards Vision Zero. And I know that the Managing Director, Michael Bradley, of the Australian Automobile Association, also welcomed the budget spending brought down by the Treasurer. The federal government, he said, is to be congratulated on responding to Australia's road trauma figures in a way that will also drive regional economic stimulus and jobs growth.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Werriwa.
The question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said yesterday, if you're good at your job, you'll get a job. Paul from West Hoxton in my electorate is in his 60s and was made redundant in December last year. If he doesn't get a job, he'll have to sell his house. Why does the Prime Minister say people like Paul haven't been able to find jobs because they're not good enough?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, that is not what I said, Mr Speaker. That is
Members
not
on both
what
sides.
I said, Mr Speaker. That is a rather ugly misrepresentation, Mr Speaker, of what I said yesterday. Mr Speaker, I was asked yesterday about
Sydney.
appointments to positions within the government, Mr Speaker. That's what I was asked about. There is 1 million people who, through the course of this COVID-19 recession, Mr Speaker, have found themselves out of work through no fault of their own. The government has been absolutely clear about that, Mr
Member
Speaker.
for Lyons.
And not only have we been clear about the fact that this COVID-19 recession, which was caused by a global pandemic, something those opposite failed to appreciate, acknowledge or understand, Mr Speaker. By contrast, the government understands that people who have lost their job through this COVID-19 recession have lost their job through no fault of their own. But we've gone beyond that, Mr Speaker. by putting in place the $101 billion JobKeeper program that has provided a lifeline to 3 million Australians and more, Mr Speaker, and more, and by doubling the job seeker payments through the COVID supplement to help Australians get through the worst of this crisis and to cushion the blow. Mr Speaker, in this country, when it comes to the response to the COVID-19 recession and the pandemic, the impact has been cushioned more so than almost any other country in the world today. Only a handful of countries, South Korea, Finland, Mr Speaker, Norway, Australia and economies like Taiwan, Mr Speaker, can actually speak of the sort of way that we've been able to act to cushion the blows to the very constituent that you speak of. And that is why the Job Trainer program provides 340,000 places right now, Mr Speaker. And for the Labor Party to come in here and take comments that are made, Mr Speaker, and apply them to completely different contexts is a grubby smear, Mr Speaker, and an insult, Mr Speaker, to all of those Australians and seeking to misrepresent, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party needs to learn how to tell the truth, Mr Speaker.
I'll give the call to the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Water. The South Australian Government has flagged a High Court challenge should the federal government not deliver the legislated 450 gigalitres of environmental water to South Australia by 2024. Minister, will the government deliver the 450 gigalitres, and if so, please detail how?
The Minister for Water.
Well, Mr Speaker, thank you for the call. Can I thank the honourable member for their question on what is a very important matter, not only for those who live in the Murray-Darling Basin, but right across our nation, Mr Speaker. So in answer to the member's question, can I say to the member that on the 4th of September 2020, I announced a $269 million package of investments to put communities and jobs back at the heart of the Murray-Darling Basin plan. I would also say to the member that this has been a very long-running proposal from both sides of government. In fact, some $9 billion of $13 billion allocated has already been spent on the Murray-Darling Basin to support the implementation of the Basin Plan. Now, to the heart of the member's question, Mr Speaker, quite simply, I don't think it's likely that there will be court action for something which is yet to happen. We have until 2024 to meet the requirements of the Basin Plan. We are committed to meeting those requirements. We will deliver on the commitments that we have made. And, Mr Speaker, I come from business. 4 years is a very long time. $4 billion is an awful lot of money, and we want to ensure that we get that delivered into communities, driving jobs, driving investment and supporting the outcomes of the plan. So I'd say to the member, it's a very good question. I'm still in discussions with our South Australian counterparts as we continue to talk to all members of the Murray-Darling Basin community. But we will deliver on our commitments. We have made further commitments in terms of the Murray-Darling Communities Investment Package, and we will continue to do what is necessary to strike the right balance between the environment, between business, between irrigators and between communities. But we are putting communities back at the heart of the Murray-Darling Basin plan.
Well said.
The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government's strong record of initiatives, including cutting taxes, is helping families and businesses to recover from the COVID-19 crisis, particularly in my electorate of Barker? And, Treasurer, are you aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barker for his question and acknowledge his experience as a lawyer and as a councillor before coming to this place. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Barker, like all those on this side of the House, understands that the Australian economy has been hit by a once-in-a-century pandemic, and it's been hit hard, and many people have either lost their jobs or seen their working hours reduced to zero. As a response of the measures that we have put in place, like JobKeeper, like JobSeeker, like the cash flow boost, like the $750 payments to millions of pensioners, carers, veterans and others on income support, we have helped save 700,000 jobs. And now the economic recovery is underway, Mr Speaker. 446,000 jobs have been created in the last 4 months alone, Mr Speaker. Consumer confidence is now up 7 weeks in a row, having recovered 95% off its lows, Mr Speaker, early on in the pandemic. Consumer sentiment was up 11.9% last week, the single largest increase in a budget month since the series first began in 1974, Mr Speaker. And this week, Australia's AAA credit rating was again reaffirmed, Mr Speaker. Now, as a result of this economic recovery underway, I was able to go and see it firsthand in the members' electorate in Barker, where I went to Murray Bridge and I went to Kookaburra Homes, Mr Speaker, and I met Steve and his other staff, including apprentices working on cabinet making, Mr Speaker. And that business employs more than 40 people, but indirectly supports hundreds of jobs through the supply chain. And he told us firsthand, Steve, how the Home Builder program had seen a massive jump in sales, Mr Speaker, helping, in his words, to secure his business into the future. This is the economic recovery that is now underway. Now, Mr Speaker, in the budget we had a number of new initiatives to support businesses and families right across the country, like Steve's Kookaburra Homes. And these included the Instant Asset Write-Off, which was expanded, Mr Speaker, to allow equipment, machinery to be written off all in year one, Mr Speaker, the loss carryback measure, and of course the income tax cuts for more than 11.5 million Australians, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that only one side of this House supports lower taxes for Australians. Those opposite don't, because the member for McMahon took $387 billion of higher taxes to the last election. Higher taxes on your income, higher taxes on your savings, Mr Speaker, higher taxes on your investments. Mr Speaker, only those on this side of the House stand for lower taxes and leaving more money in Australians' pockets.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, in relation to the job his office arranged for Mr Croney, the Prime Minister said, if you're good at your job, you'll get a job. Are the million Australians unemployed during the Morrison recession out of a job because they're not good enough? Or is it closer to the mark to say, if you're in the know, you get a go?
The Prime Minister has the
Mr Speaker, the flippancy of the opposition when it comes to the COVID-19 recession honestly reflects very poorly on them, Mr Speaker. They come into this place with glib, cheap insults, Mr Speaker, to those in this country who are doing the hardest, Mr Speaker, the hardest
members on both sides
in generations, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about this matter of what has occurred with those who have lost their jobs in this country. 1 million people, Mr Speaker, in a matter of weeks, fell out of employment or had their jobs reduced to 0 hours. Correct. And since that time, Mr Speaker, more than 760,000 people have found those jobs again, or their hours have been restored. Correct. That has been our response to the COVID-19 recession, Mr Speaker. Those opposite don't even seem to understand that the COVID-19 recession was caused by COVID-19. Mr Speaker, those opposite don't know how we got into the recession, Mr Speaker, and so they have no answers when it comes to how to find the way out of it. This is a Labor Party, Mr
Member
Speaker,
for Gorton is warned.
who has no plan for the economy for Australia, Mr Speaker, no plan whatsoever. They don't even know what the impact of COVID-19 has been on people's jobs, on their livelihoods, on their businesses, Mr Speaker. And what we have done, Mr Speaker, is we've been restoring our economy from these shocking losses, getting people back into work, getting businesses reopened, restoring the health of Australians. And, Mr Speaker, Australians know that. And the sort of cheap rhetoric we have from the opposition coming here flippantly flippantly, with political barbs, Mr. Speaker, seeking to take advantage of unemployed people in this country, does them no credit. The Australian people know that they cannot trust the Labor Party. They cannot trust this Leader of the Opposition, because they know when it comes to the matters that really go to their security, their economic security, their national security, Mr. Speaker, they know that this Leader of the Opposition just isn't up to it.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's commitment to provide reliable, secure and affordable energy as part of our economic recovery plan will support jobs, including in my electorate of Lindsay? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question. I commend her on the work she's doing in the manufacturing sector in her electorate of Lindsay, establishing the Advanced Manufacturing Task Force, which is critical to businesses in her electorate, businesses like Pasin, that manufactures windows, Spantec, that produces safety harnesses in the building construction industry, Mr. Speaker. Now, like all of us on this side of the House, she understands how important affordable, reliable energy is for Australian manufacturing, Australian workers and Australian households, of course, Mr. Speaker. And she knows that gas is central. Gas is central in our energy mix to the economic recovery, supporting the jobs of 850,000 Australians working in our manufacturing sector, Mr. Speaker, producing critical goods like fertiliser for agriculture, PPE, which is used in so many different industries, building materials as well, of course, Mr. Speaker. And she knows that we're empowering customers in the gas industry, that we're unlocking supply in projects like Narrabri in New South Wales, and of course investing in critical infrastructure, pipelines and transport of gas, Mr. Speaker. The member for Lindsay asked about alternative approaches. And the member's opposite position on gas is not to have a consistent position. The opposition to gas from many of those opposite is an attack on the livelihoods and well-being of so many Australian workers, their families and the businesses that employ them, Mr. Speaker. And as the Australian Workers' Union has noted, the Australian Workers' Union no less, Mr. Speaker, the New South Wales manufacturing sector is unreservedly underpinned by the economics of gas. Unreservedly underpinned. Now, that doesn't sound like an industry with no future, as the member for Hindmarsh would have it, Mr. Speaker. You abandon gas, you abandon the jobs of Australian workers, Mr. Speaker. Now, it's no wonder that the head of the AWU, Daniel Walton, has labelled the member for Hindmarsh's position, and I quote, not just morally indefensible, it's strategically moronic. Strategically moronic, Mr. Speaker. He goes on to say, we may as well kiss goodbye to our heavy manufacturing sectors if we follow the advice of the member for Hindmarsh, Mr. Speaker. And that's what you get if you rely on the advice of the member for Hindmarsh. Only the Morrison government has a plan for jobs and economic recovery.
The member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. Why was $12,000 of taxpayers' money spent on 4 Cartier watches for Australia Post executives?
What?
Members on my left, the Minister for Communications.
I do thank the Shadow Minister for her question. I was as shocked and concerned as everybody else to discover this when it was revealed in estimates this morning. I have spoken to the Chair of Australia Post. I've explained that the government's view is that the boards and managements of government business enterprises need to take great care with taxpayers' money. They need to take great care with taxpayers' money. I have informed the chair of Australia Post that the shareholder ministers have asked our respective departments to carry out an investigation into this matter, and I've asked the chair to provide the full support of the company for this investigation. And I've also asked the chair to inform the chief executive that she will be asked to stand aside during the course of this investigation. This is a matter which the government takes very seriously. We expect the board and management of government business enterprises to deal with taxpayers' money with scrupulous care, and that is what this investigation will be focused on, and it will examine the conduct of all involved in how this matter occurred.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is acting to protect our iconic environment and the Australian jobs that go with it?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Barara for his question. Yesterday I spoke about how the Morrison government is driving a $1 billion transformation in the waste and recycling industry, creating 10,000 jobs over the next decade. And our budget continues our government's commitment to protecting our environment and Australia's economic recovery, with an additional $1.8 billion in new investments, protecting our oceans, preserving national parks and heritage areas, recovering our unique natural environment from bushfires, and, as we come out of COVID, supporting jobs in regional communities. We're spending $233 million, the largest ever investment in our national parks, creating more than 1,100 rural and remote jobs in Uluru, Kakadu, Budiri and Christmas and Norfolk Islands. $33 million will provide infrastructure upgrades across our World Heritage sites, from the wet tropics in the north through the Gondwana rainforests of the Great Dividing Range to the Tasmanian overland trails and the Ningaloo coast in Western Australia. Recognising the significance of our Indigenous, convict and military history, more than $60 million is being invested for the maintenance and restoration of Sydney Harbour's Federation Trust sites, including on Cockatoo Island and Subbase Platypus. Reef HQ in Townsville is getting further upgrades, taking our investment for the world's largest living coral reef aquarium to more than $40 million since last year. These measures demonstrate our commitment to protecting, preserving and showcasing our unique natural environment and the communities it sustains. $28 million will be invested to sustainably manage our marine park network, 3.3 million square kilometres, one of the biggest in the world. $14 million will be invested in cleaning up lost and discarded fishing gear, or ghost nets, throughout the waters and beaches of Northern Australia. And we're continuing our investment in the International Partnership for Blue Carbon to assist our Pacific family tackle problems with marine pollution. $20 million we're investing in building oyster reefs that stabilise coastlines, clean the water and create thousands of kilograms of new fish stock. Our precious native species remain a critical focus as we continue to roll out over $200 million of bushfire habitat recovery. Our environmental protection draws heavily on Commonwealth-led research from our National Environmental Science Program, backing our on-ground practical action with work in areas like threatened species, climate adaptation, marine parks and land care activities. We are providing economic and environmental leadership.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is also addressed to the Minister for Communications. When did the Minister first learn about the 2018 purchase of 4 Cartier watches valued at $12,000 by Australia Post with taxpayer funds?
The Minister has the call.
I indicated in my previous answer that I was shocked to discover that when it was revealed in estimates
The Minister might just pause for a second. Look, we're not going to have this situation where a minister's asked a specific question and I can't hear the answer because there's a whole series of interjections. It's completely pointless. If you're going to ask the question, please listen to the answer. The Minister has the call.
I've concluded my answer.
Now, Leader of the Opposition can resume his seat. So I just say to both sides, just to all members, I'm just going to make this point now. I will start ejecting people rapidly. That is a prime example where the minister did give the answer. It'll be there in Hansard. I could just hear the answer. I believe the Leader of the Opposition didn't, and that is because those were interjecting loudly behind him. And a minister can conclude their answer at any time. So that is a prime example of why interjections are completely counterproductive. If there's a repeat of that, those level of interjections, there'll be no warnings for the rest of the day, there'll be no mentions, there will just be ejections. The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Social Services. Today is the second anniversary of the National Apology for Victims of Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. Will the Minister representing the Minister for Social Services update the House on the status of the National Redress Scheme?
The Minister for National Disability Insurance Scheme and Minister for Government Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Ryan for his question? Today, as the House knows, marks 2 years since the Prime Minister apologised to victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse, a period of Australian history that should not be forgotten. And can I acknowledge the very fine words of both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition this morning. The redress scheme was a key recommendation of the resulting Royal Commission. The Royal Commission made 84 recommendations, all of which have been implemented through the National 10-year Redress Scheme, which commenced in 2018. The latest figures I can report, as reflected by the Prime Minister this morning, are that 8,297 applications have been received. 4,670 decisions have been made, with payments totalling some $320 million, an average of approximately $82,000 per applicant. Nearly 300 non-government organisations, on top of state and territory Commonwealth government institutions, have signed up. This includes sporting groups, churches, local community organisations and schools. It covers 53,000 sites. It's clear that together we are on the right track. Now, the 31st of December this year marks another crucial date for the scheme. We're actively working with 158 institutions who have committed to join but have not yet done so. Sadly, 4 institutions have decided not to join, being Fairbridge, Jehovah's Witnesses, Kenya Communication and Lakes Entrance Pony Club. I think it's clear that we are firm on our resolve on this issue. Should any of the 158 institutions not fully commit and join the scheme by the end of the year, after having 6 months or more to join, they will be publicly named and face the same consequences of the 4 institutions just named. Now, improving the scheme and ensuring survivors of institutional child sexual abuse are supported remains a clear priority, I think, for us all. We're now in the process of reviewing the scheme with an additional $104.6 million over the next 4 years to further fund redress support services and employ further independent decision-makers. We anticipate the review will be presented to the government early next year, with recommendations to be considered by the Minister's Government's Board. Finally, I echo the Prime Minister's fine statement today. No currently or future named institution who refuses to join will be the beneficiary of any government grants, funding source or preferential tax treatment. They will not advance while victims and survivors remain forgotten. Mr Speaker, we all know there's more to do. We have over 7 more years of the scheme's life, and that'll mean further improvements. We can't undo the wrongs of the past, but we are taking meaningful steps to address those wrongs.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. How is it that on his watch, in the middle of the worst recession in almost a century, with 1 million Australians unemployed, businesses collapsing and $1 trillion of Liberal debt, this government is taking no action against the Liberal-appointed Australia Post Board, which spent $12,000 of taxpayers' money on Cartier watches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The accusation that the Leader of the Opposition just levelled against the government is false. Mr Speaker, earlier today, when this was brought to my attention by the report of Senate estimates, I was appalled. It's disgraceful, and it's not on, Mr Speaker. And so immediately I spoke with the shareholding minister, the Minister for Finance, and the minister responsible, Mr Speaker, the Minister for Communications. And from those discussions, the following actions ensued. And that was that there had to be an independent investigation done by the department, not by Australia Post, that the Chief Executive should stand aside immediately. Mr Speaker, that Chief Executive should stand aside immediately, and that, Mr Speaker, the independent investigation should look into the conduct of the board members and their governance, as well as the actions of the management and the executive. That report will come back to me and my members of my cabinet, and if, Mr Speaker, there are issues to be addressed with board members, then they will be addressed then, Mr Speaker. This all happened within an hour, Mr Speaker. So appalled and shocked was I by that behaviour because, Mr Speaker, as any shareholder would in a company raise their outrage if they had seen that conduct by a chief executive, a management or a board, Mr Speaker, they would insist rightly on the same thing. Now, we are the shareholders of Australia Post, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Australian people. So that action was immediate. That action was immediate. And if the Chief Executive wishes to stand aside, well, not wishes to stand aside, she's been instructed to stand aside, and if she doesn't wish to do that, Mr Speaker, she can go.
We're moving to the next question. The member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on steps the Morrison government is taking to protect Australian children from exploitation? And is the minister aware of any concerning trends during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. I just don't see any higher priority for our government, for our nation, than protecting Australian children. I want to make sure that we can do everything we can within the Home Affairs portfolio to protect children and women in particular. And when you look at the activities online of crime syndicates and those people who are involved in sexual predatory behaviour, we need to make sure that we provide support to the agencies to defeat those activities and to keep our Australian children safe. We have managed the budget well, Mr Speaker, and it's put us in a position that we can prepare our country in the best way possible to deal with this virus and the consequences of it. And the consequences don't just relate to the health impacts on Australians, because we do know that we have seen quite a surge in the number of activities online detected by the Australian Federal Police and the other agencies within the Home Affairs portfolio, particularly around people who are targeting children who are spending more and more time online. Now, the AFP has received considerable support in this budget. We've invested $300 million over 4 years to strengthen the work of the Australian Federal Police, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that they do, particularly at the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. I'll be back in Brisbane tomorrow morning to officially open that facility, and it's a $70 million investment that we've been able to make. It's the biggest investment in Australia's history into protecting Australian children from the scourge of those who would seek to abuse children either online or in the real world. And, Mr Speaker, I want to praise the work of the investigators, of the intelligence analysts, of the NGOs who will be involved. Bruce and Denise Morecambe will be there tomorrow as well, and other NGOs will work with us, as they have done over a long period of time, to make sure that we can look at innovative ways in which we can deliver messages to kids at school to help people stay safe online, to make sure that we can speak to parents about having an active discussion with their children to make sure that they are safe online. And I want to highlight the fact, Mr Speaker, that from the 1st of July 19 to 30 June this year, ACE received 21,000 incoming reports of child exploitation. That is compared to 14,000 reports in the previous financial year, a dramatic increase, and over the period of COVID, the centre has identified a 163% increase in child abuse material on the dark web in the 3 months of April to June of 2020 compared to the same period last year. It's why the work is absolutely essential, and it's why we'll continue to work hard to make sure that our budget is in good shape to help protect Australians and in particular children online.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Can I briefly, Mr Speaker, just associate,
absolutely, yeah.
Just associate Labor with the comments of the Minister and join with him in thanking all those officials. This must be a terrible job, you've got to say that, and it must cause a great deal of stress, and I thank them and join with the Minister in his comments.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In the budget, the government established or announced extra money for more than 30 different grants and fund programs worth at least $5.7 billion. Given the rorting that occurred with sports rorts, community development grants and the Building Better Regions Fund, in the absence of a National Integrity Commission, what guarantee is there that decisions will be made on merit instead of colour-coded spreadsheets designed to target marginal seats?
The Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And of course, the debate around the Integrity Commission, as is evidenced by that question, should be, but is never, when the opposition is involved, dealing with facts. They just cannot bring themselves to deal with actual facts, not even in talking with respect to something as important as an Integrity Commission. And the question goes to the timeline of the government's development and consultation for an Integrity Commission, and I can explain that timeline for the House, Mr Speaker. The first time that this really became an issue was when members opposite were previously in government, and the opposition's previous position was stated by the Shadow Attorney-General when they were last in government, and that was, in his words, "I am not convinced that there is a need for yet another integrity officer." That statement, Mr Speaker, can be found in an article entitled "Expenses Critic Mark Dreyfus Embarrassed Over Taxpayer Ski Trip to..."
Attorney-General resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The question didn't ask about alternatives. It asked about the National Integrity Commission, which both sides of parliament say they support.
Yeah, also say, look, just with respect to it, I was listening very closely to the attorney because certainly the question mentioned the concept of a National Integrity Commission, which the attorney is addressing, but it had other elements there as well, and I call the attorney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And so the timeline for that commission was such that Labor supported, as the Leader of the Opposition said, the Commonwealth Integrity Commission before the last election. They said that they would need a 12-month period after that election to ready a bill, so that would be May of 2020 this year. They further noted, in fact, it was the Shadow AG who went on to note that as well as drafting, they'd need time for consultation, eminently sensible. He, the Shadow AG, said, "We also acknowledge that designing a body as complex and as significant as this is properly the work of government with all of the resources available to government." So, Mr Speaker, whether Labor, had they been in government, devoted all of the resources of government in May this year in the height of a global pandemic to a complicated, significant, complex, intensive consultation period on an Integrity Commission, or whether they would have applied all of the resources available to government to dealing with the pandemic, is thankfully something we will not find out, but it would have been a very strange decision. It is also true, Mr Speaker, that the government received its first draft on the bill in December of this year, which I might note is December of last year, which is much earlier than their timeline of 12 months. And one of the things that we have been doing, one of the things that I have been doing is looking at ways in which you can improve that bill, that draft. And one thing that I am absolutely convinced that draft must have is a mechanism to prevent vexatious, baseless, politically motivated, time-wasting referrals And why is that? Because of the Shadow Attorney-General, who has an Australian record of 10
Leader of the
baseless,
Opposition will resume his
malicious.
seat. I just say to the attorney, he needs to confine himself to the question to be directly relevant.
So they're the type of referrals that this bill has to deal with. They are the type of referrals that the New South Wales Police Commissioner described as a great diverter of my time. And perhaps if I close with the words of the Shadow Attorney-General—
No, the Attorney-General needs to resume his seat. That's good, because we reached the same position at exactly the same time. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has blamed his refusal to establish a National Integrity Commission on the COVID crisis. How was it that the government still found time to establish a higher education integrity unit to look into cheating students in the middle of the pandemic in Melbourne, but not a National Integrity Commission to look into sports frauds, water rorts, airport rorts, forged documents and taxpayer funds used for Liberal Party branch stacking?
The Attorney-General.
I thank the member for a question because it gives me an opportunity to pick up exactly where I left off on the last occasion, members. And that was with the Shadow Attorney-General, whose words I completely agree with, describing the complexity of dealing with an Integrity Commission. And this is what the Shadow Attorney-General said about that.
Just say no. The Attorney-General needs to be relevant to the question. There wasn't. It doesn't preclude him, I say, from quoting where he's relating that material to why the government has taken a certain position, but where he was crossing the line, where he ended his answer, where I was about to sit him down, was where he was moving beyond that. But if he's quoting someone as explaining the complexity of a government position, that's fine. But I'll listen carefully.
Thank you. And I think words like this are words I would join issue with. I think that they are a correct description of the difficulty and complexity of an Integrity Commission. Words such as, I think the lesson to be learned is that an anti-corruption bodies are difficult to get right and must be very delicately designed. They are of a quantum again to examination bodies and people cheating in exams or matters of that nature. But the question also went to why has the government chosen not to engage in a consultation period around this very complicated Integrity Commission and chosen to do other things? Why have we chosen to do other things? Well, the government chose to focus all of the resources of government on dealing with a global pandemic which threatened hundreds of thousands and millions of Australian jobs. So what types of things were we focusing our time and energy on? Well, we were looking at developing flexibilities inside the industrial relations system to save hundreds of thousands of jobs. We looked at passing privacy legislation so we could establish a COVID Safe app which would allow states like New South Wales to successfully contract tracing.
Members on my left.
Obviously, Mr Speaker, that's something that the members of the opposition wouldn't have done. They don't think that it's important to use these type of facilities to be able to contract trace in these jurisdictions. We reformed bankruptcy laws to save hundreds of thousands of businesses and jobs in Australia. JobKeeper, JobSeeker, ensuring that all of these things went to saving Australian jobs. Why would we do that? Because it seemed to us that that was completely the right set of priorities during this pandemic. What I would also note for the member for Sydney is that the work for the Integrity Commission, as I described yesterday, is actually already underway in this budget with the allocation of very substantial increases in funding to the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity, which will increase its ASL by 38 staff members so that it can be the first part of this Integrity Commission, which has to be designed carefully. When you are looking at something like examinations for tertiary students, that does not involve something as delicate and important as the extent to which, if any, you have retrospectivity applying around the criminal law of the Commonwealth of Australia to activities that occurred before and to
Attorney
different
General's
standards.
time has concluded. I call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Decentralisation and Regional Education. Will the Minister for Decentralisation and Regional Education please update the House on how the Morrison-McCormack government's investment in decentralisation builds on our economic recovery plan by creating jobs in rural and regional Australia?
The Minister for Decentralisation and Regional Education.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank very much the member for Mallee for her question and for her ongoing support of the government's decentralisation agenda. We support decentralisation on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, and for the National Party it's core business. And indeed, as Blackjack McEwen once said, Mr Speaker, we are the specialists for rural industries and rural communities. That's what Blackjack McEwen said. And since 2013, Mr Speaker, this government has relocated over 1,700 jobs from the major capital cities, and we've grown the regionally based public service workforce from 12% to 14%, Mr Speaker. And we all know, Mr Speaker, that this budget was the budget that saved Australia. It was. It was a historic budget for regional Australia. And in this budget we also saw the first elements of the government's new decentralisation agenda emerging, taking further steps down the path first blazed by Blackjack McEwen and those great National Party members of the past. And we know, Mr Speaker, and the member for Mallee knows, that COVID-19 has brought great heartache and pain to Australia and Australian communities. But one thing it has shown is that people can work productively from home. And if you can work productively from home in the suburbs of the big cities, it's only a short hop, skip and a jump over the Great Dividing Range where you can work in the country. And, Mr Speaker, this budget invested $41 million to support businesses to relocate to regional Australia. This investment will commercialise raw material supplies, Mr Speaker, allowing firms to move close to their raw material supplies, securing the supply chain, commercialising those raw materials and bringing with them jobs and growth and prosperity to country Australia. We've also taken the handbrake off public sector decentralisation, Mr Speaker, meaning that departments no longer have to find internal budget savings to make the move to country Australia. And we've changed the definition of decentralisation, Mr Speaker, so that it no longer supports relocations from the inner city to the outer suburbs of big cities. We are turbocharging the government's decentralisation agenda, and there is an enormous amount of interest in decentralisation. Those people wanting to move from the city to the country were once called tree changers or sea changers, Mr Speaker, but as Bernard Salt coined a new phrase in The Australian just recently, those folks are now known as Vespers, virus escapees seeking provincial Australia. We want the Vespers to come to country Australia. We want them to come to regional Australia and help build the future of our country communities.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure. Are there any other probity, integrity or corruption issues relating to Western Sydney Airport land?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, not that I'm aware of, Mr Speaker, and there are investigations, and I've talked about these ad nauseum this week under question from the member for Ballarat about the Leppington Triangle. There are investigations going on into that, conducted by Dr Vivian Tom, conducted by the Australian Federal Police and conducted by the ANAO, an organisation that I know that the member for Ballarat is very, very familiar with.
The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question goes to the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. Will the minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is working to address agricultural sector workforce shortages and supporting our regional neighbours by restarting Pacific labour mobility?
The Minister for International Development and the Pacific.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Fairfax for this important question and note his experience in the agricultural sector, the work he's done advocating for Australia's place in the Pacific. Pacific labour mobility has made a vital contribution to Australia in recent years, up to 12,000 workers a year working in our agricultural sector, making an important contribution. It's also one of the most important parts of our regional engagement, I find, when I visit people in the region. The economic contribution that we make through Pacific workers to villages and people back in country is immense. While we feel these critical workforce shortages in our agricultural sector, we know those vital remittances really do make a great contribution to the GDP of so many countries in our region. And that's why, from the beginning of this crisis, the government acted from the outset to ensure and preserve that access to the Pacific Labour Scheme could continue. On 4 April, we announced those visa measures that enable people that were here to remain for an extra 12 months and also to redeploy to approved employers. And then on 4 August, of course, we announced the approved pilot with the Northern Territory for the mango season to make sure we could bring on people and demonstrate it was safe to the states and territories to do so into industry. And on 21 August, the government announced that with the support of states and territories through National Cabinet, recruitment under the Pacific Labour Scheme and the Seasonal Workers Program would resume more broadly. Today, of course, I'm pleased to announce to the House that the first cohort of 161 workers from Vanuatu under the restarted schemes arrived in Darwin last week. Those people are in quarantine. But I'm further pleased to tell the House that all 10 partner countries — Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, Vanuatu and Timor-Leste — have agreed to restart their schemes. That means 15,000 eligible job-ready workers who have experience in Australia, who have been pre-vetted, ready to come to Australia and supply our markets. I also remind the House, of course, of the immense success of the Pacific countries in protecting themselves from COVID. 14 of the 17 countries in the world that are COVID-free are in the Pacific region. And I want to say, of course, that we're going to continue working with states and territories to bring as many people here as we can under these vital schemes to protect jobs and to help with our economic recovery, Mr Speaker. Just this week, I want to also commend the New South Wales government, who announced that they will bring 350 workers from Fiji under the Pacific Labour Scheme to fill labour shortages in the meat processing industry, and we welcome that development from New South Wales. As we know, there's more plans for more charter flights and more workers to come back to Australia. We know the vital importance of these schemes, vital importance to our agriculture and primary production sectors, but also to our neighbours, the economic contribution to their GDP, to the villages, to the people of the Pacific. And this government will keep working with the states and territories to get every worker we can here to meet those critical workforce shortages, supply the labour needs, but also do that great economic recovery for the Pacific and our region.
The member for Griffith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can the Prime Minister claim he hasn't had the time to establish a National Integrity Commission when he spent a week campaigning for the Queensland state election, including attending an LNP fundraiser with the Deputy Prime Minister and the Queensland opposition leader?
The member for Griffith knows the rules on props. The Prime Minister.
I thought she had more to add, Mr Speaker, to her question. Mr Speaker, it was a great opportunity last week to go to Queensland and to share with Queenslanders from the Gold Coast all the way up to Cairns, Mr Speaker, through Townsville, through Rockhampton, through the suburbs of Brisbane, and share with them the economic recovery plan that was handed down by Mr Speaker, the Treasurer, when we last sat in this place 2 weeks ago, Mr Speaker, whether it was a Caboolture Smash Repairs, whether it was a steel fabricators, whether it was a coral trout exporters in Cairns, Mr Speaker, visiting apprentices, trainees, businesses, communities, Mr Speaker, across Queensland. And most excitingly, Mr Speaker, it was so exciting to hear from businesses how they are graduating from JobKeeper. Mr Speaker, a JobKeeper program that ensured that they could keep their business together, keep their employees together, and then on the other side they could shift gear. they could shift gear and grow again and put on more apprentices, put on more trainees, bring employees back that they had to let go to increase their hours. Mr Speaker, in Queensland last week, I had the opportunity, as did the Deputy Prime Minister, also was in Queensland, going up and down the Bruce Highway, Mr Speaker, with the Minister for Resources, and to see the great work also being done by our magnificent members, whether it's the member for Herbert or the member for Dixon, Mr Speaker. I was with the member for Dixon in a sign-making business, Mr Speaker, doing a remarkable job, investing in new technology. All of these businesses, all of these communities, Mr Speaker, understanding that this budget was the budget that Australia needed and it was the budget Queensland needed, Mr Speaker, to get Queenslanders working again, Mr Speaker, to see Queenslanders coming back into jobs, because, Mr Speaker, for Queensland to go forward, it is important.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Prime Minister.
You were there.
No, when I say Deputy Prime Minister, that means stop talking. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Speaker. On direct relevance, the question goes to the inability to act on a National Integrity Commission but finding the time to attend a Liberal Party fundraiser.
Yeah, so just on that, I don't think I need to hear from the Leader of the House unless he wants to. If the question just did that, we've been over this ground before, that you would have a point. But when a question asks the Prime Minister why he spent the week campaigning, he's entitled to explain how he spent the week. And he's refuting that part of the question. If it wasn't in there, he wouldn't have the chance to refute it. The Prime Minister has the call.
And in speaking to the apprentices and the business owners and those who are working to get Queensland working again, Mr Speaker, it made me reflect again, how good is Queensland, Mr Speaker? How good is Queensland? Now, the Leader of the Opposition would know because the Queensland government won't let him come to Queensland, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition couldn't spend 14 days in the ACT to spend a day in Queensland, Mr Speaker. I tell you, Mr Speaker, I welcomed the welcome from the Queensland Premier to come to Queensland, but there's one person who's not welcome in Queensland, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition. And he's not that welcome in Newcastle, according to the member for Hunter either, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there was a time you had to get on a bullock tray to get from Maitland to Newcastle. That wouldn't have been an excuse.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health, Regional Communications and Local Government. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison-McCormack government is supporting the health needs of regional Australians?
The Minister for Regional Health, Regional Communications and Local Government.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Nichols for his question. Recognise that he's a strong and fierce advocate for his community, but I would imagine last week he would have been incredibly proud of his community, as what could have been quite a disastrous outbreak of COVID-19 in the Shepparton area saw it a remarkable community effort, not only from the health authorities, the doctors, the nurses, but the entire community, the way that they managed what could have been a serious outbreak to a very, very low level of infection. And, Mr Speaker, like Shepparton, regional Australia has done very, very well during this pandemic. Regional communities have managed to handle the small number of infections that we've had, and the rest of Australia has recognised that regional Australia is now the place to be. As we've seen in previous generations, people are looking to the regions now to invest, to move, to look for jobs. The thousands of jobs that are available there right across the full spectrum, from the professions right through. And in the budget, Mr Speaker, the government recognised that we're going to have a growing and prosperous region. We need to have a health force, a health profession that is capable of looking after this expected growth. And that's why we've put extra funds in the budget to be prepared for further outbreaks of COVID, telehealth funding, the respiratory clinics, more capacity for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. But we've also put funding into things that will stimulate professionals wanting to look to go to study medicine and practice medicine in the regions. $125 million into rural clinical trials, so that not only do the people in regional Australia get the benefits of those life-saving trials, but professionals who want to undertake that research can go and do that in a regional area. $50 million to extending rural training, and that builds on what we've done in previous budgets with the Murray-Darling Medical School, training local people in local regions. Indeed, the member for Nichols will have a facility in Shepparton as part of the Murray-Darling Basin Medical School. And so we all know, Mr Speaker, that those people that train in the regions, come from the regions, are more likely to settle and work in the regions. And so in the budget we also funded 5 trials looking at a multidisciplinary approach in New South Wales to delivering health care to smaller, more isolated communities. And the Rural Health Commissioner, Professor Stuart, will be looking at how they go. Trials that were built from the community, knowing that the government does not know best, communities know best, supporting those communities. What works will be spread out and looked across in other areas of the country.
Concluded. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can he confirm that on his watch, it was revealed this week, airport rorts was referred to police in July, Home Affairs is investigating the cash for visas scandal linked to a disgraced former Liberal MP, secret taxpayer-funded market research by an ex-Liberal Party pollster has been shared with his office recommended a long-term Liberal Party associate for a lucrative government contract, and Australia Post spent $12,000 on Cartier watches.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What I can confirm is that this week Australia's AAA credit rating was restored, Mr Speaker. Once again, Mr Speaker, in the face of the biggest recession caused, Mr Speaker, caused by COVID-19, the biggest recession we've seen in this country since the Great Depression, Mr Speaker. Despite those challenges and the unprecedented investment to keep Australians in work, to provide that lifeline both to people's jobs and their livelihoods, Mr Speaker, the unprecedented investments in health services and mental health services, and the massive hit that took to the budget, Mr Speaker, Standard & Poor's, they looked at the government's fiscal management and economic management, and they concluded that Australia's balance sheet was strong as it went into this crisis. It was tested during this crisis, Mr Speaker, but was able to stand, Mr Speaker, to this crisis.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The question went to airport rorts, cash for visas, secret taxpayer-funded market research, looking after Liberal Party mates, and Cartier watches worth $12,000. The Prime Minister hasn't mentioned any of those issues.
And he doesn't have to. That's the point. And these questions that simply ask a Minister or the Prime Minister to confirm several things, they invite a yes-no answer, but the practice makes very clear that whilst they can invite that, that can't be required. And the problem with questions that just say, can you confirm it's Thursday, just make it very, very difficult, and it does allow those answering to really answer in the way the Prime Minister is. I've been listening carefully to him. I'll keep listening as the Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I can also confirm that this week it was revealed in the consumer confidence surveys, Mr Speaker, for the first time since they began in the early 70s, that this budget has impacted positively consumer confidence, Australians' confidence, more than any budget since that time, Mr Speaker. And that is exactly what Australians needed. They needed this budget, Mr Speaker, to give them the confidence. Mr Speaker, there's only one assumption that really matters in this budget, and that assumption that we have made as a government in putting this budget together, as we have continued over the course of this week to outline the many measures as ministers have responded to and questions today, as they have all week.
Just say to the Prime Minister, you are now moving away from relating your material to the question.
Mr. Speaker, what I'm seeking to do was I was asked to confirm things, and I have confirmed that there has been an historic response to this budget, Mr. Speaker. That is the point I'm making, and if I could go on in making that point.
No, I'll just say to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, you related your material, Prime Minister, to the question, and I outlined what I thought was the deficiency in that type of question that invites a yes/no answer, and that can't be compelled, and you're entitled to confirm a number of things that you've already done. But, as I say, moving on from that to a general question about the budget, a general answer about the budget and everything the budget does, is not the same as confirming all of those facts and figures that you did earlier, because the question didn't mention the budget at all.
Speaker, I can confirm that the government is providing lower taxes. I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, that we're supporting businesses. I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, that we're supporting Australians get back into work. I can confirm that we're providing record support through the Job Trainer program, Mr. Speaker, some 340,000 training places in partnerships with the states and territories. I can confirm we've put $14 billion in new and accelerated infrastructure projects to support a further 40,000 jobs in this country. I can confirm that HomeBuilder is supporting construction jobs, Mr. Speaker, all around the country. I can confirm we're backing manufacturing through the Minister for Industries plan to ensure that advanced manufacturing jobs will be here, Mr. Speaker. And I can confirm all of those matters because they assume that the Australian people know how to respond to a crisis. That's the assumption we've made about the Australian people in all the decisions we've made. We're believing in the Australian people, first and foremost, in how we are recovering from the COVID-19 recession.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the minister update the House on the Morrison government's measures to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls?
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank the member for O'Connor for your continued support and commitment to Indigenous women and children in your seat. The Morrison government is committed to advancing opportunities for Indigenous women and girls, given the historical disadvantage and some of the challenges that they face. We're providing significant investment through all Commonwealth agencies to provide support for women, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls. We provide $99.6 million to support education, leadership, health and wellbeing outcomes for girls and young women, $72.4 million for academy and mentoring projects to improve Year 12 attainment and support students into post-school pathways, $25 million for Indigenous Girls Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics Academy, and $2.2 million to support girls and young women through sport and other youth development activities to empower them to realise their potential. More than $75 million for family violence prevention and legal services to address family violence. A further $13.8 million investment in the Indigenous Women's Program, legal services and supplementary legal assistance activities over 3 years from 2020-21 to 22-23. An additional $35 million investment in Indigenous-specific measures under the 4th Action Plan and $2.9 million for the Wiwi Yani Uthangi Women's Voices project. This also is made up of the job opportunities that we've created. I have been into some of the academies and into some of the schools where the programs operate, and I went into one in particular where there's a group of young high school women. And when I went in, they asked me to go through a process that they put in place to create a secure and safe environment for them. And they asked me to pick up the object that they hold while they make this commitment to honour each other's confidence. What I saw was young women who had been damaged regain confidence to be able to speak and share what they had experienced, but provide peer support to each other. Deadly Girls with the Wirrapunda Foundation not only
achieve academic outcomes but provide levels of support and interaction. And when we consider some of the adverse events we see through media, these programs are absolutely important and critical in giving young women a journey that is better than what we would expect for them. Our investments for the boys, as I was asked, is $54 million. For the girls in the same program is $57 million. So our commitment is extremely strong to young women and to the young girls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and can I just briefly